Well, welcome back, everyone, to Digital Hammurabi. I am Dr. Josh, and with me today is Dr. Joel Baden. He's professor of Hebrew Bible at Yale Divinity School. He earned his MA in Northwest Semitics at the Oriental Institute out in Chicago, and his PhD in 2007 in Hebrew Bible from Harvard. Dr. Baden is a Pentateuchal specialist, and he has written extensively on issues surrounding the formation of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. Perhaps most notably, his 2012 monograph, The Composition of the Pentateuch, Renewing the Documentary Hypothesis, which is published by Yale University Press, and the link is in the description below, so please check that out. I just read it, finished reading it again today for the second time, so phenomenal book. Really good resource, too, just as a side note. It's an interesting layout. There are sort of test cases that you run through the book. It's just really useful to see how the documentary hypothesis works out, but we'll talk about that here in a few minutes. So this incredibly complex and highly debated topic will be the focus of our discussion today. So Dr. Baden, again, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
So before we kind of get into the questions that I sent, so I wanted to make sure that we got the absolutely the most out of this discussion. I sent the questions ahead of time so we could, both kind of think through how to talk about them, and of course you much more than I. But so that everyone is on the same page before we get started, would you just take a second and explain what is meant by the Pentateuch or the Torah? I'm sure most people know, but just in case. And then in particular, why the issue of its authorship is so important to the discussion.
Sure. So the Pentateuch, or the Torah, quite simply, is the first 5 books of the Bible. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And, those have been a sort of coherent corpus for ever. Well, since it came into existence, it has been a separate sort of corpus within the Bible, and it's the story from creation in Genesis to the death of Moses at the end of Deuteronomy, and contained within it are all of the laws in the Bible. Right? So all of the laws that God gives to Moses to give to Israel are contained in those books, specifically in the last 4, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. It's long been the core of the Hebrew Bible, at least. It's obviously central to Judaism, but also clearly central in certain times and places in ancient Israel as well. So the question of why its authorship is at stake, right, it's got a fairly long history, that question. Already in the early post-biblical period, in the period of what are called the classical rabbis in Judaism, so the first 5 centuries, 5-6 centuries of the Common Era, it was assumed and stated explicitly that Moses wrote the books, right, the first 5 books, which are known as, right, like the 5 books of Moses, and that sort of is a part of the Talmud, the collection of Jewish law, where they go through who wrote all the books, right? Moses wrote his books, Joshua wrote his book, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this assumption that Moses wrote the Torah, so it goes back 2,000 years, maybe probably a little bit more, although we don't have like quite as direct evidence for that statement. But there's reasons to think that Moses might not have written. We can start with all of it, right? So there's like the history of the development of the question is in the even already in that Jewish text in the Talmud, they say, right, Moses wrote all of his. There's a conversation. Wrote all of his stuff except the part of where he dies, right at the end of Deuteronomy, right, where it says Moses died and then all the stuff of his burial. Maybe Moses didn't write. There's discussion. Maybe he wrote it because like he knew it was going to happen in a prophetic sense, but maybe Joshua wrote it. Okay, so like we're already like maybe in the medieval period, some Jewish commentators, specifically one named Abraham ibn Ezra in France, said yeah, there's like actually a bunch of things that it doesn't look great for Moses to have written. So things that make it look like this text was written from a perspective later than Moses's. So for example, Deuteronomy begins by saying, you know, this is what Moses said to the Israelites on the other side of the Jordan. But like if it says on the other side of the Jordan, then it must have been written from inside Canaan, where Moses never got. So how, that doesn't quite make sense, right? Or some historical references that don't quite match up. My favorite verse that that people were like, that doesn't make sense for Moses to have said, is where it says in Numbers 12, it says, now Moses was the most humble man on earth, which I always thought is the funniest thing for Moses to have potentially written. But like you can see why people would say, maybe Moses didn't write that. Anyway, so the question of maybe Moses didn't write all of it was already came up in like the 11th, 12th century. But in the Enlightenment, this became sort of the standard accepted position. Spinoza and Hobbes and Locke and all these, you know, authors who sort of said, nah, Moses doesn't work as the author for a whole bunch of different reasons. And at the same time, people started saying, it's not just that it couldn't be Moses, it's that it can't just be any one person. And that has nothing to do with like the timing of it. It has everything to do with, and this is really the core of what we're here to talk about, has to do with the fact that the Pentateuch as it stands is not just repetitive, but contradictory within itself in ways that are almost unimaginable for a single author to have written, but in ways that are like conflict with itself. So you don't know what the truth is. So, I mean, and it's riddled with this, right? And it starts in Genesis, in the two creation stories of Genesis 1 and 2, and it goes all the way through the entire text. Constant things, little things. What's the name of Moses' father-in-law? I don't know. It says like two different things. Slightly larger things, like where was the tent of meeting? Was it in the middle of the camp or was it outside the camp, right? Like there's different texts that say different things. And then there's, you know, like, I don't know, it depends on your perspective, maybe slightly larger things like how long did the flood last? Right? Like we all know it lasted 40 days and nights, except for the verses that say it lasted 150 days and nights, right? So like there's tensions even within stories, there's tensions across stories, and then there are, you know, there are quite big ones like specifically in the Jewish tradition, right? What do you do with laws that are contradictory? And there are plenty of contradictory laws there also. It says, you know, one law in Leviticus and a different one in Deuteronomy. And so the question at the heart of the conversation here is, what explanations can we give for the fact that this piece of literature looks this way? Right? We could try and argue for a sort of single author model, but you'd be pretty hard pressed to come up with a sensible model in which somebody wrote a text that like fails to communicate on a sort of basic level of both plot and sort of agreement in law, right? Assuming they wanted to tell me something about these laws, if I don't know which one to follow, I'm in trouble. So how is it that the literature looks this way, right? So I have a literary problem, right? I have a text that reads weird. And so what is the possible solution? And a bunch of possibilities have been offered over the centuries, right? It was a bunch of little small pieces that got put together. And so like a bunch of things of different origins that got smushed together, and that's why it looks this way. Or it's, you know, it was one thing and then it expanded and expanded and expanded, and that's why it looks this way. And the model to which, you know, I tend to adhere, and that has been around for now, you know, 150, 170 years, is one that envisions independent documents that have been interwoven. So when I get repetitions and I get contradictions, it's because I'm reading what were originally two versions of the same story that have been interwoven. And that's weird, but it like answers a lot of the questions and makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And you know, one of the examples that you give, to sort of go back a little bit, you talk in the beginning of the book about Genesis 37 and the Midianites and the Ishmaelites, and which one is it? And could you maybe just talk about that? Because I think that's a really key example, not just because of how blatant, I think, or obvious the problem is, but because Genesis 37, as you show, separates so nicely, and yet people have given, and you go through them almost in a painstaking process in the book, showing everybody's attempt to try to reconcile who took Joseph down to Egypt. So could you just maybe talk about that a little bit, just to flesh it out?
Yeah, I mean, I open with that one because it's because I think it is pretty smack you in the face, right? So we're in Genesis 37, which is the first chapter of the Joseph story, and the brothers are conspiring to kill Joseph and throw him into the pit, and and then right they look up and they say, oh, here comes some here comes some Ishmaelites. Some Ishmaelites passing by, and Judah says, hey, let's sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites. Right. So far, we're pretty much following like the plot of the Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. So, right, like if you're familiar, you're with me. They say, hey, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. And his brothers say, yeah, that's a good idea. And the next verse says, when Midianite traders passed by, they pulled Joseph out of the pit. They sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites, who brought Joseph to Egypt. So it sounds like the brothers were like, hey, let's sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites. And almost while they were talking, some Midianites came by and had the same idea and sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites, right, who then brought Joseph to Egypt, which is very weird. But what's worse is the very end of the chapter says, the Midianites sold him in Egypt. So like I've got brothers who want to sell Joseph to Ishmaelites. I have Ishmaelites who take him to Egypt. I have Midianites who come by and pull him out of a pit and sell him into Egypt. Like, what is happening there, right? It's the kind of thing where if you're not reading for like plot, right? If you're not reading for plot and you're reading because you're interested in themes or you're interested in like moral messaging, this isn't the most important thing. But if you're asking what is happening in the story, there's no obvious answer to what's happening in the story right there. And those are the kinds of places where I think we really need to pay attention, right? Who could ever have written a story like that? And the answer is nobody did, because when you start untangling, okay, what if so the Ishmaelites and the Midianites can't go together. So it turns out, right, like you end up with two distinct, complete stories in this chapter. One in which Judah says, hey, let's sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites, and they do, and the Ishmaelites take him down to Egypt. And one in which Joseph is left to die in the pit, and Reuben is planning on going back and saving him. Before Reuben can get there, Midianites pass by, grab him, and they take him down. They're two perfectly good stories. Not going to take time reading them to you, but it's in the book. Right? So like there's these two perfectly good stories, and suddenly all of the problems with the text as a story are resolved. And these are not problems that, one of the things that you often hear is, well, you're just making up problems to solve, right? Not making up this problem. And you can tell that not only because I think it's pretty on the surface, but because everybody who reads this is what you said, everybody who reads this chapter and does interpretation of it comes up with some fanciful explanation for what's going on here. The brothers sold him to the Ishmaelites, who sold him to the Midianites, who sold him to a third, like another group, or there's all sorts of solutions. But when there's lots of solutions, that means there's a problem to be solved.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Right. And the thing is, the contradictions in the Pentateuch, right? We're not the first ones to see them. We in the 20th, 21st century, with our post-Enlightenment, sort of senses of how stories should be, we're not the first to see any of these, right? Early readers in the early post-biblical period, especially the rabbis, were like all over all of this, and they pointed to all of these things, and they came up with explanations for them. But again, the fact they needed to explain something indicates that there was a problem, right? It's not that we have different senses of what's going on in the text. We're all equally confused. We just have different notions of how to answer, right? They come at it with a sense of, well, we are starting from the knowledge that this text was written by Moses and is, a single thing. So now I have to explain it in that light. And in the Enlightenment period, we're coming at it without that presupposition. Let's not assume it was written by Moses. Is there maybe another explanation, or even a single individual? Is there another explanation that works? And the last thing I'll say about that, just not about 37, but about resolving contradictions in this way, is that this isn't even a post-biblical process. It's a biblical process. That is, within the Bible itself, you can see later biblical authors and texts reading the Pentateuch and trying to figure out what they're supposed to do with contradictions in it. And the best example of this, and this is one that I love talking about because I think it's super funny, and it has to do with law, not narrative, but it's a great example. Right? So in Exodus, when it comes to the laws about how you're supposed to prepare the Passover sacrifice, in Exodus it says you have to roast it. It must be roasted in fire. You can't boil it, and you can't eat it raw. And Deuteronomy says you boil it. Okay, so what am I supposed to do with the Passover? I don't know. It says both things. So when the Book of Chronicles comes along, 400 or so, and says, and they are depicting the King Josiah, who was like the great king who brings back the obedience to the law, right? And Josiah reads in the book that they have to do all these things. It's like, so Josiah offers the first Passover in many, many centuries. And how does he prepare his Passover sacrifice? Chronicles tells us he boiled it in fire, according to the law, right? Which is to say, right, like the author of Chronicles is already seeing that there's two things. And he's like, it must mean you do them together. And then he even says, right, according to the law, as if, right, the interpretation is the law, which in fact it comes to be, right? So all of these things, all the interpretations become the resolutions, right? The ways that this is now read. But again, they all start from the point of, nope, like there's something that needs resolving here.
Mm. So, obviously, we're going to talk about some of the ways that scholars today wrestle with these contradictions and these doublets and those sorts of things and try to figure out how it was a good theory for how it came together. But just stopping at this point, would you say that this idea that there are contradictions, that there are these types of problem passages that exist, is this a minority position among biblical scholars? Is this sort of a fringe thing that people think that Genesis 37 is problematic, or would you say this is the consensus view among biblical scholars?
This is decidedly the consensus view. And again, there are a bunch of different theories about how the Pentateuch came together, but they all involve multiple hands, right? I think that outside of, I think, apologetic minded institutions, there's really no, that's not even a discussion question, really, whether it is a single author or whether it's Moses or not. We're well past that. And again, we've been past that in for 1,000 years in some senses. Mm-hmm. But certainly, since the Enlightenment, it's effectively been recognized. But yeah, certainly today in the academy, the multiple authorship, however that then conceived, and again, and for the most part, responding still to the same problems, right? So even if I and another scholar don't agree on how the Torah came together, but the problems we're seeing in the Pentateuch, right, are usually relatively similar, right? Mm. Everybody recognizes that there are two laws about what to do with the Passover sacrifice. Everybody recognizes, if Genesis 37 is like a little bit obscure, I'm not sure it is, but like everybody recognizes the Genesis 1 and 2, just to pick a really like important one that people fight over. Like the people out in the world are going to know, right? I don't know of anybody in the field who says, oh no, that's one hand is responsible for Genesis 1 and 2. Again, this is one of the things that I occasionally say is, right, like if you ask anybody, just tell me the story of creation from like the beginning of creation, from in the beginning until like Eve eats the apple, right? Like you say, just tell me that story, and everybody can do it. Everybody goes, oh, that's easy, right? So in the beginning, there's nothing, and then there's like God makes stuff 6 days, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and he rests on the 7th day, and like he's got like he creates everything, all the things, and then he rests on the 7th day, and then they're in the garden, and then they're in garden, and then God makes women from Adam's rib, and like he names all the animals, and like none of that tracks. Right, there's like a big thing, there's like a big leap in the middle that everybody just takes because we're used to the stories being told in that order. But you can't, they don't go together, right? Things are created at different times in different orders. Like it's very, when is woman created? In Genesis 1, she's created simultaneously with man, right? And probably not just 2 of them, but probably many of them, right? And in Genesis 2, right, we all know, right, Adam's wandering around by himself, and he gets lonely, and there's animals, and he takes a nap, and then he wakes up, and there's a lady there, right? Like, that's a very, very different, it's a totally different order of events. Yeah, you can do that with a whole bunch of stories, right? The flood story does that equally, right? You can ask anybody to tell you the story of the flood, and everybody will tell you the same story, right? Absolutely the same story, right? Noah took 2 of every animal, male and female. He took them to the ark to keep them alive. And then it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, and the ark landed on a mountain. And Moses sent out a dove, and it went like this and this. And finally, it brought him like a piece of like a twig. And Moses came out, and there was a rainbow at the end. That's the universal flood story. Mm-hmm. And it is like not at all what's in the Bible. Yeah. Not at all what's in the Bible. But like we just like ignore all the little things that make the flood story particularly kind of unreadable.
Yeah, I mean, I think something similar happens if you were to say to someone in Assyriology, like, all right, go ahead and tell me, set up over the 3,000-year period of Mesopotamian religion, tell me the pantheon. Like who's father? And he's like,
even more to the point, if you ask him to tell you the story of Jesus' birth or the Passion's even better. So it's the story of Jesus' death. They'll tell you like a neat story that is not the story of any one of the Gospels, right? It's just like the extracted common version. That's not actually what's in the text at all.
Yeah. Well, so then if we move to trying to explain it, and we're going to dig down into the documentary hypothesis, because I think obviously you're like the guy to talk to about this, which is amazing. But I do want, I did research for a video that I was doing to try to really flesh out the different positions, and the European position sometimes is just very difficult for me to really wrap my arms around completely. I never feel like I completely have it. So could you briefly explain, you touched on it a little bit, but the 3 main hypotheses that scholars have formed to explain the Pentateuch. So we're going to talk in more in depth about the documentary hypothesis, but like the fragmentary hypothesis and the supplementary or the revisional hypotheses. And if you want to talk about, like, seems to be a divide between American and European scholarship. Maybe you can talk about that briefly.
Right. So I alluded to what were at one point, like in the end of the 19th century, middle of the 19th century, right? The 3 main like views for what do we do with this information? What do we do with the problems of the Pentateuch? So one of them was like, it's just little bits and pieces that have been smushed together, called the fragment hypothesis. And then there was it was like one thing with a layer and then a layer on top, and it just keeps getting added to, and that's called the supplementary hypothesis. And then there's the one that I've said about, which is like independent documents that like got put together like this, and that's the documentary hypothesis. At this stage, there's still a documentary hypothesis. The other 2 have sort of coalesced into a single position, which in my book I called the European model or the European approach, mostly for lack of a better term. I don't want to define it as just like not mine. The non-documentary, which I do sometimes. But also European's not particularly fair because there are practitioners of it outside of Europe. But it's certainly fair to say that it is a predominantly and originated in Europe position. So here's their position. And again, there's a broad swath of scholars who actually hold a real wide variety of different versions of this position. The idea is this: what we have in the Pentateuchal text is really a collection of relatively small blocks of tradition. Right? So like stories. I'm not talking about necessarily like text, but like stories. So for example, the story of the flood. It's like one little independent unit of thought. But even more so, right, when I'm looking at a longer story, I look at the story of the patriarchs in Genesis, right, the ancestors, because that's a big story. Maybe there's like a big ancestor tradition, but within that there seem to be traditions about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and even within the Jacob traditions, there seems to be like a whole cluster of stories about Jacob and Esau, and also a cluster of stories about Jacob and Laban, right, and his like all his getting married stuff over in Aram. And there's this tradition about Jacob at Bethel, right? Jacob, who goes, right, this is the scene, right, he sees the angels going up and down on the ladder or the staircase, whatever, right? That story, the notion is, right, what if we thought about this not as starting from the idea of long continuous stories, but like, what if I started from the small thing? What if I started with a story about Jacob at Bethel, and I thought, okay, so like I can understand that this story probably existed at one point, like in Bethel, as a story for how come we have a temple here? Oh, I know, it's because our ancestor Jacob built it when he encountered God here, right? That would be a totally normal explanation for why a temple exists. So I've got a story about my ancestor Jacob at Bethel, but I've also got some stories about Jacob, like, and his brother Esau. And what if I put those together? Now I've got like a whole Jacob complex, and like now the story about Jacob going and getting married and with his Aramean relatives. So I've got this. Now I've got a whole like big complex of Jacob stories, and I'm going to combine that with the complex of stories about Abraham that some other folks have developed. And now I've got a whole like ancestral cycle there. Now I can combine that ancestral cycle with all this big story about the Exodus and Egypt, right, with which it never had anything to do. And so what this model does is it takes this notion of these independent traditions and it says, I can even tell you like which words in the text belong to those traditions, right? So I'll take the Jacob at Bethel story and say, okay, so here's like the core story that I think was the original tale about Jacob at Bethel. But here's a part where it refers to he was running away from Esau. So clearly that's not original to the Jacob at Bethel story. That belongs to the Esau stuff. It's been added to connect the two stories. So I got a core story with this little redactional element to get me into like the bigger complex. And that's kind of the idea if you just do it over and over again. You have smaller bits, right? That's kind of the remnant of the fragments. Smaller bits that are reflective of ancient traditions that have been collected into larger units. Those larger units have then been connected with other large units and overlaid with sort of theological reshapings, right? So the idea being, okay, so I've got my Jacob stuff and my Abraham stuff, and I put them together, and not only do I put them together, but I'm going to put them together and I'm going to connect them by introducing this theme of the divine promise to the patriarchs. And that's going to be the thing that links my new literary text. So I've got, so now I have an ancestral cycle with a theological sort of like grounding and unifying feature. And I connect that with my Exodus story with its own unifying features. And, you know, and I add something to connect those. And so it grows, and that's sort of the supplementary part, right? So it's like smaller units, bigger units, combining, and then layering them, and then a whole series of other stuff that gets added in as the text moves through various hands. And that's the non-documentary approach. And that can be simpler and it can be more complicated, but that's basically the idea.
So is one of the things that seems like is problematic, and we're just reading through the book, is that it's a change, and correct me if I misunderstood this, but it seems like it's a change from saying that these were individually oral traditions that were then brought together in one source and small actual written traditions. So you have like a little story and then another little story and another little story, and but written down.
Right. The idea of there being traditions in the text is one that goes back to the first half of the 20th century, and a scholar named Martin Notes and his predecessor Gerhard von Rad, who were who came up with this idea that, like, that really looks like what we have here is independent traditions that appear in somewhat different forms. For example, right, Moses gets water out of a rock twice, right, which is a weird thing to have happen twice. But if you think, right, there was a tradition like that, you could ask people, right, did Moses get water from a rock? And they'd be like, yeah, let me tell you that story. And like they tell it slightly differently. Okay, so over time I get two sort of crystallized stories of Moses taking water from a rock, and one of them ends up in one of the documentary sources and one ends up in another. So that the existence of underlying traditions is kind of assumed at this point. It was by everybody. Me as much as anybody else. As you say, the problematic thing is to say, okay, there was a tradition of Jacob at Bethel. Which words in my Bible are that tradition? Right? So that what was an oral tradition that multiple folks could have had access to or told in different ways is no longer like oral tradition the way we think about it, which is what I just said, right? Something that's passed around and something that has different versions and different variants. It's not an oral tradition, it's just a tradition that is represented by these words in this page, and as far as I know, exists nowhere else in the world. So what happens then is you are left with, okay, so I have a story of Jacob at Bethel, which in the biblical text takes up 12 verses, 13 verses. Genesis 28, 10 to 22, I'm pretty sure. That's the Jacob at Bethel story. It takes up 13 verses. Even that, like if I were to say, like, okay, I've got 13 verses and that was my written text, then got integrated with this other written text. What is my 13 verse written text? Right, like it's not, was it a Post-it note? Was it an index card? Like what they had, it would have been like on a shard of pottery, like, the size of my hand. And those were used for writing stuff, but not for writing stories, right? And certainly not for writing, right, as far as we know, the one version of this story. So there's a material problem in trying to understand sort of where these small and original stories came from. But I think there are other difficulties with that theory that have nothing to do with the materiality of it. But things like the big one for me is this: that what we're assuming is sort of a model of sort of consistent accumulating growth, where the intention with every new layer is to reshape the whole, presumably in the image of the new layer, right? So if I think that, if I'm reading and it says, I'll use the example of the flood story, because it's an easy one. Right, if I'm reading the flood story and I think that the original version of the flood story said that it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. And then someone comes along and adds the new layer to it. And the new layer says that the waters came from above and below and they lasted 150 days. Okay, so I understand that the new layer wants to tell me that it's 150 days. But when the new layer just gets added on to the previous one, I don't have a text that says 150 days. I have a text that says 40 days and 150 days, and I don't know which one is right. Right? So it's not sensible to imagine that somebody with a new argument will write it in as a layer of a text that they've preserved the entire original of, because once they've done that, I don't know which one is the original and which one is the new layer. Which one am I supposed to be listening to, right? It doesn't come color-coded, right? But you'll see, right? You can see analyses of text where it's like, well, here's the original, it's in black, and here's the new part, it's in red, and you can see how the red part reshapes the black part. Yes, if it's colored, if you tell someone what the colors are, but they didn't have that back then, and nobody knew that there were layers until we came along, right? Like, 12 years ago or whatever, and said, I think there's a layer. So, I think that notion, and again, that argument for why why it couldn't have been built up that way. That's an argument from the 1850s, right, where they were first sort of figuring this stuff out, and someone's like, actually, it could be that was the case, but here's why it doesn't make sense. So we're, again, it's not new argumentation.
It was interesting to me because in some ways it felt like sometimes it's an unfalsifiable argument. So you were talking about in the book where if you have two pieces together and they've got to be bridged by this layer, that you would say, well, that that is part of the original source that shows the transition. And they said, no, it can't be. It's got to be the thing that bridges them. And so it seems
right. There's a circular argument, right? In order for me to identify these two originally independent things, I have to be able to take them apart and like separate them. In order to separate them, I have to take out the stuff that connects them. Okay, so I've taken out the stuff that links it, and I say, okay, here's my two original things, and they were brought together by adding this linking thing. But like the only way I knew they were original things is because I took the linking thing out to begin with, right? So this is a really, now all of biblical studies is circular, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. But there are bigger and smaller or prettier or uglier circles. And that one I think is a pretty problematic circular argument, right? Essentially, it suggests, right, ancient authors were, I guess, incapable of continuous, long, complex stories with, you know, where they call back to each other or they allude internally, right? If I have a text that links to other stories and like agrees with all the things in both of them, my assumption is like that's the thing that was meant to, like it was part of the original thing and it got me from point A to point B. But again, if you start from the notion, I have to find these small individual bits, then you're always going to be having to remove stuff that connects them.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to read Sumerian or Akkadian literary texts and think that people in the ancient world weren't capable of writing complex literary compositions that refer internally to
Sure, or
themselves.
Ugaritic, or I mean, right?
Yeah.
Or even biblical, right? Like,
yeah.
You know, there's plenty of biblical stories that are relatively long and complex. There's parts of the David story. There's the Book of Ruth. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff out there. Sorry, go ahead.
No. All right, so let's talk then. Again, you talked about several times about the documentary hypothesis, and you know, it's individual sources that have come together. Could you just take another second and sort of solidify that?
Yeah.
And then my third question was, the documentary hypothesis seems to have always been a source of contention, sometimes for scholarly reasons, sometimes because of religious commitments. The form of the documentary hypothesis is different today, as the title of your book says, right? You're renewing it. So from like the days of Wellhausen. So could you take a few minutes after you kind of, again, flesh out a little bit more specifically what what it means to have different sources, and explain some of the reasons that the older form of the documentary hypothesis was criticized and how these have been addressed more recently?
Yeah, of course. Okay, so as I said, right, the theory is that there are multiple sources, and I want to start by saying that that's the idea that there are 4 sources in the Pentateuch is not the presupposition of the approach, but the conclusion, right? Nobody went into this going, I'm going to find 4 sources in here, right? Like it wasn't like that was the get-go. It came out of things like, that's weird. There's like 2 creation stories. And there's 2 flood stories. And even more, the 2 creation stories like actually kind of match in interesting ways with the 2 flood stories, right? The way that the cosmos is envisioned, the question of where water comes from. There's all sorts of things that link the 2 creation stories and the 2 flood stories. And there's, like if you so you find these 2 strands and you can follow them, right? What you're following is not their style, right? Not the words they're using, but the argument, the things they're saying about where people are and who they are and like how the world works. It's plot, right? It's who, what, when, where, why, and how, not the words I use to say who, what, when, where, why, and how. So again, right, the notion of right, so you're reading, you read Genesis 1 and you come to Genesis 2 and you go, oh, this cannot be the same thing. And then you've got 2 tracks, right? And everything you come to, you can say, does this connect with one or the other of these? And they do, all the way through up until you get to like Genesis 15. And then suddenly it's like, that's weird. This, like what I'm reading now, doesn't really fit with either of those. And so it turns out the thing I'm reading now connects with other stuff later on. Mm-hmm. And now I've got 3 tracks. And like it sounds a little complicated, but that's it, right? There's 3 tracks that like everything connects with one of, for the most part, like all the way through until you get to Deuteronomy, at which point suddenly you're like, this is something completely different, and you get your their fourth source, which is entirely confined to Deuteronomy. But the other three are interwoven essentially from the beginning of Genesis, or at least, you know, the third one picks up in like Genesis 15 or so. But, you know, it's about the consistency of their claims about the plot. Who are these people? Where are these people? What are their relationships, right? Where are they? Who are they? What are they doing? Who do they know? You know, there's all sorts of little things like, you know, when do characters die? When are characters born? It's not the same necessarily in each story, and you can see where assumptions are made in one text that relate only back to like one and not the others of what came before, or that look ahead to something that is not consistent. So again, in the, you know, in Exodus and in the tabernacle material in Exodus 25 through 31 and 35 through 40, right, talks about the tent of meeting, and in Numbers we're told, right, like it's that tent of meeting is in the middle of the camp, and it contains the tabernacle where God physically dwells. And right, how does it work? God is in there and nobody can go in, and God communicates to Moses. God is inside and Moses is outside, and that's how the communication works. And then you read in Exodus 33 that the tent of meeting is outside the camp. And how does the communication work? Moses goes into the tent and God comes down outside the tent, and they communicate that way. So it's like completely opposite in all of these ways. Fine. You're reading through the stories that come after that, and there are some stories where the tent is in the center and God is inside and Moses has to be outside. And there's some stories where the tent is outside and Moses is inside and God is outside, right? So like, it's clear that this story is connected with that description of the tent, and this story is connected with that description of the tent. And it's like not more complicated than that, really. It gets more complicated than that. But like the big picture is that. So we end up with 4 sources, which are poorly named. Just to put it out there. And you know, you've put up there, right, you called this JEDP, right, which are the names of the 4 sources according to the documentary hypothesis. The easy ones to explain are D, I told you Deuteronomy, and P, which is for priestly, right? And that's the one that's got Genesis, the creation story in Genesis 1, but also all of Leviticus and the tabernacle stuff in Exodus and most of the laws in Numbers. And that's the one that thinks that the tent is inside, right, inside the middle of the camp, among other million things that it thinks and nobody else does. J and E are the other 2 that are mixed with P in Genesis through Numbers. And they're called J and E because there was a time in scholarship when it was thought that the J source referred to the deity only by the name Yahweh, or in German, Yahweh with a J. And the E source referred to God only with Elohim, right, the Hebrew word for God. That's true to a small extent in Genesis. It doesn't really work after that. They're not so good names, but in any case, they recognize that there are distinctive claims. According to the J source, everybody knew God's name from the get-go, right? Already in the end of chapter 4, Genesis 4:26, we have Enosh is sacrificing in the name of God, in the name of Yahweh. And in the E source, God reveals his name, Yahweh, to Moses in Exodus 3, right, in the famous episode at the bush. So like there is a difference there, but like it's not the best name. But those are your 4 sources, J, E, P, and D. And some of them, they agree on basic things, right? That basic plot, Abraham, right, creation probably, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Egypt, Exodus, wilderness, mountain, you know, and then like some wandering until they got to the border of the promised land. That much everybody agrees on. Outside of that, nobody tells it the same way, right? And this isn't like super surprising. Again, we're talking about a time when oral tradition would be like the way that all these things were mostly communicated, right? Written is relatively rare. And oral tradition lends itself to geographical variation and class and status variation and just all sorts of sociological differences that account for varieties of tellings. You know, it's not so different from, and this is an example I use all the time, if you were to ask like someone from like New Hampshire and someone from Georgia to tell you the history of the Civil War, right? You're going to get like the 10 basic things. Like we're going to know that like it started, you know, at Fort Sumter, and we're going to know that it ended right? The way that it, like with the North winning. And I would guess, like, and the battles would all basically be like enumerated in the same order, but almost everything else about how you tell that story is going to be different. And that's still true today, right? Like 150 years afterward. So, you know, when we're talking about, and it's true, right? Like, and there are facts there, but like when you're talking about like these sort of traditional stories for this culture, there's all sorts of reason for it to be varied across the different tellings. So the bringing together of these 4 different tellings into one chronologically ordered story results in weirdnesses because they don't tell things in the same order necessarily, right? Again, right, one story has Moses getting water from a rock like reasonably early, like before they get to Sinai, and one of them has it like after they've left Sinai. So I end up with a story in which he gets water from a rock 2 times, right? So that's the, you know, the material practice of bringing these things together results in a weird story that is contradictory and repetitive. But because whoever put them together, or however they put together, one of the principles seems to have been to have left them mostly whole, we can take them apart again, right? Because they weren't manipulated so that they weren't flattened, right? When we read the Torah, the Pentateuch, it reads problematically, which is great for us, right? Yeah. Because it allows us to see where the seams are. So that's you know, that's the basics of how that works. Now, that what I just said, largely the same as it would have been 150 years ago, and you mentioned Julius Wellhausen, who was the great popularizer of this idea at the end of the 19th century. But what the advances that we have made in documentary thinking today, such that we now talk about a neo-documentary hypothesis, right, to differentiate us from the classical. There was a lot of concentration in previous scholarship on words and style. But you get lists, right? J uses this word, and E uses this word, and P uses this word. And that's fine if it's a description of what you have learned from having read the sources separately. It's not so good if you use it as a way to differentiate the sources to begin with, right? So if I say, only P can use this particular word for possessions, right? Then every time I find that word, if I'm not sure what the what text I'm reading, I go, oh, there's the word, it must be P. But that's not particularly sensible. That's you know, that's like saying that because one person uses a word a lot, nobody else gets to use it. Right? And that's just not how language works, right? They all spoke Hebrew, right? All of the authors knew Hebrew perfectly well. So we can't really use style as a way to primarily disentangle. So style, things like this, things like style or names for God or genre even, right? Like we can't say, this person likes to have dream sequences. Okay, but like that doesn't mean nobody else can, just because one does primarily. So one of the things that we're trying to do now is be very cautious about really sticking to the question of plot. Right? We're not going to let issues of style or theme get in the way. Right? One author can write a story with multiple themes. Right? It can be as complex as you like. Right? The principle here is, if I had a book, if I had a Pentateuch that had, you know, a variety of themes and had diverse language and style, and you know, took a, you know, had a whole bunch of genres mixed into it, and yet it was completely level in terms of its plot, and it agreed with itself totally in all those ways, we would never say that there's more than one author. Right? It's because the plot is problematic that we say there's more than one author, and so our solutions have to be plot-based and not based on other stuff. Right? You can't solve a plot problem with style. Right? They're not the same. They're not the same thing. So the neo-documentary hypothesis is very focused on plot and very narrow definitions. There was a time in scholarship when it was assumed that like a story had to have been so important that everybody told it. So you would take a story. So like the plagues are a good example. When you read the plague story in Exodus 7 through 10 or 11. There are problems with it. There's enough problems with it to suppose that there are 2 plague stories that have been interwoven there. Again, like perfectly with no, like it's perfectly done. 2 stories that have been interwoven, but lots of scholars for a long time said the third source couldn't possibly not have had a plague story. So what are the things in here that I can attribute to that third source? You ended up with like fragments of sentences, mostly based on like wording, right? Like this other source likes to use this word, so like maybe I'll just give it this phrase. Like it doesn't make sense. But there's an assumption that the assumption that they told the same story more similarly than they do, and we don't hold that at all. I don't think there's any reason to think that everybody must have told the plagues story. The same way that there's no reason to think that everybody told the story of Abraham sacrificing Isaac. Right? There's no need to assume that. Right? It's our desire to have like our sense of the biblical text be like as ancient and universal as possible. That's why we like grab onto that as a thing. But you know, there's entire characters that are missing from sources, multiple sources, and there's entire episodes that we think are super important. The sacrifice of Isaac. Nobody knew about that except for the one guy who wrote it, right? Like, so this is another sort of unique feature of the neo-documentary hypothesis. And the other is, again, the attempt to make it as simple, right, Occam's razor simple as possible, leads to at least the methodological sense that we don't want to be, right, we don't want to be multiplying entities, right, which is Occam's razor, right, as few as possible. So I don't have any reason to think that the four sources were put together over a series of multiple redactional steps, right, like J plus E, then J and E plus P, then, right, like I don't need it to be that way because I have no evidence for that being the case, right? In fact, all the sources are interwoven in exactly the same manner, right? J and E are not put together differently from J and P or P and D or whatever, right? They're all like done the same way. I'm going to assume it was one redactional process and not multiple ones. I think those are some of the main novelties. Again, it's almost all about trying to get it simpler, because one of the reasons that it fell apart and was sort of discounted in scholarship increasingly into the middle of the 20th century was because it got a little top heavy, right? You got like every like words became determinative, and right, there were all sorts of little bits that it didn't make sense. How are you going to defend an argument that says, yes, there was a story about the plagues and these three words belong to a different source? Like, how do they belong to that source, right? What did it mean? They were like floating, like those three words are floating around, or somebody looking at the source and said, I'm going to tell you this story and these three words from this one. Like, it just doesn't, it doesn't quite make a lot of sense. People thought maybe this is just like not a great way of thinking about it. And it wasn't a great way of thinking about it. But there's, you know, the evidence that began the theory, again, like going back to the middle of the 19th century even, one of the things that I like to point out is that the big theory of my book, the big arguments of my book about how these sources are put together are the same theories that were put forward in 1853, right? By like that one guy who like saw that this was the way it should work. So it's not that this is like new, it's that we're trying to like clean up from what is an accumulation of crap, like that is like accreted to the theory over time. And that's the deal.
It's interesting, and I know we're running into the 55-minute mark, but maybe this is a good kind of question to close with, because I think it links to this. So in spite of the disagreements among scholars, Reinhard Kratz in a 2016 article wrote this, quote, in all of the hypotheses, so for everybody in the audience thinking about the three different, different hypotheses for how the text goes together, scholars are in agreement that the Pentateuch, Genesis through Deuteronomy, or the Hexateuch, Genesis through Joshua, is composed of at least three literary strata: Deuteronomy, the priestly writing, which consists of P and the Holiness Code, and the non-priestly text in Genesis through Numbers. Everything else is up for discussion. So could you elaborate on this statement and focus maybe on what the consensus view among biblical scholars would be concerning this? Like, what is it that you would say everybody's agreeing on, like Genesis 1 and 2 has to be two different hands, or things like that, so that in the audience, people go, here's where everybody kind of comes away saying, yes, all the scholars' consensus view is that these things are true. Sure.
So Kratz is pretty much right. I'll leave Joshua out of it, just because it's a complicated extra thing. But he's right. The priestly stuff, right? And everybody will agree. Genesis 1 is priestly. All of the tabernacle material is priestly. I mean, lots of actually much of what's in the P document is not a problem for people, right? We mostly agree and have mostly agreed on P, 95% of it for like 100 years. Little bits in the edges here and there. Now, how late P is, how early P is, how the original priestly document and whether there's later priestly stuff. There's all sorts of conversations about that. But the notion of major priestly stratum, right, with all the ritual laws in Leviticus and all the tabernacle stuff in Exodus and most of Numbers, all the legal stuff in Numbers, 100% everybody's on board. The existence of a Deuteronomic source that comprises the majority of the book of Deuteronomy, if not all of it, everybody agrees on that too. Again, how old it is, how many layers there are, how is it related to the material in Joshua through Kings, how is it related to the material in Genesis through Numbers? Like, these are all up for debate. But that Deuteronomy, most of it, constitutes a separate literary entity that was not written to be part of or to be next to the priestly material and vice versa. That seems pretty reasonable. When you take those two out, you're left with the non-priestly, non-Deuteronomic material. What I call mostly J and E, and at that point you're into complete, absolute, like, disaster area in terms of like what people, how people are thinking about this. I think there's basically two sources. Some people think there's 45 different layers, right? Like that's where it is most complicated, admittedly, most complicated, least clear, and the places where I still have problems sort of separating what's going on are always those places. Right? It's never places where it has to do with P or D, but there are some places where I'm not entirely sure what's happening, and those are all places in the non-priestly. But yes, Genesis 1 is priestly, and Genesis 2 through 4 is not. And Genesis 5 is priestly. And Genesis 6, the first part is not, and then you get into the flood story, which is both. And like, everybody will agree on, again, once we all agree on what P is, we mostly do, we're all also going to agree on what not P is. Like, so those big blocks are, now again, are they layers? Are they sources? Were they brought together simultaneously? Were they brought together in a sequence? Or is there some material that precedes the compilation of these texts? Is there some that comes after, right? There's all sorts of, movable parts. But again, I mean, as you asked in the beginning, right, how consensus is this? Kratz is correct, right? This is consensus. There are 3 major blocks. And I think we would all agree, each one of which has an extensive literary prehistory of how did this thing come to be, and many of which have post-histories, right? Like, once this thing was written, how was it edited? And then we all agree that after the material was all put together into the Pentateuch, roughly as we know it, stuff was added later still. Right? There are parts of the Pentateuchal text that we all sort of say, this belongs to none of those 3. It's like a later text that's reflective of the some messy situation thereafter. So there's 3 big blocks, but untold number of hands that have had their way with this. Again, which is not surprising, right? When you think about the transmission, the physical transmission of texts, right? It had to be copied, and scribes have their hand in it. And we know from the New Testament, from Mesopotamian literature, right? It's a constant sort of updating and changing of little things here and there. And it's my assumption that stuff has been changed all over the place that we'll never know about because it was changed silently, as it were.
Well, I got to say, like, this hour has flown by for me.
Indeed.
I'm going to ask Megan to come in and ask whatever audience questions that have come up.
It's Megan!
Silently.
It's Megan!
That's how I feel every day.
You are a very nice man. I'm glad I married you. We have several super chats, a selection of people generally just saying how much they're enjoying themselves. So Scott Duke for $4.99 says, I'm so glad I have this afternoon off. I really love Digital Hammurabi and I like this topic. Scott, thank you for joining us. I'm glad you could be here. Lulu sends $5 and says, great content. Thank you. And Enkidu5 sends $5 and says, these types of interviews are the best. And I do concur. These interviews are indeed the best. To the proper questions, Gerard Dassin sends us $4 total for 2 questions and says, could you compare Moses and Homer as legendary?
Yeah, so that's a really good, that's a good comparison, a good question. Doesn't work exactly. Of course, like Homer's not a character in his own story, right? The way that Moses would be. But what you have is, what works there is the association of a culturally legendary author figure with a certain like corpus of writing, right? My understanding of the Homeric stuff is Homer's name sort of gets attached to this epic traditions, the same way that Moses's name kind of gets attached as author to these books that are actually mostly about him, right? But you get a whole, especially in Judaism, you get this entire like post life of Moses being thought of as, right, Moses as lawgiver, right, as paradigm, right, paradigm for lawgiver, paradigm for prophet, in the way that Homer becomes paradigm for poet, right? So that, in fact, like it's easy enough for, in the New Testament, for it to say, like, doesn't Moses say, right, when they mean, like, doesn't the books that we associate with Moses say? The same way that, like, so I think it's a very nice analogy.
Excellent, thank you. And he also says, what is the go-to rabbinic unifying explanation?
Well, so look, the rabbinic perspective is that the text of the Torah in particular is like perfect, and it is divinely inspired, and it was it's unalterable. But that what we have been given by God is mechanisms for interpreting the text that give our interpretations the same validity as the text itself, right? So in Judaism, in the rabbinic position, it's the notion of oral tradition or of oral law, the oral Torah, right? Since this is the unifying explanation, there's a text that says, in the tradition says, God gave Moses on Sinai the written Torah, and also the entirety of the oral Torah. That is all interpretation of the text. Which means that we sitting around interpreting it and trying to understand how to make it work within our sort of system of thought are not doing something like new. We're like remembering, in a sense. We're bringing to the surface the authentic, right, original interpretation that came with the text to begin with. Right? We're just accessing divine truth that is as equally relevant as the written text itself. The written text is the basis for it, but you know, the spoken, the interpretive is not any lesser. And that's kind of the way that Judaism got around the fact that it's full of things that you need to explain. Right? Essentially, they legitimized the explanations as divinely inspired as well.
Excellent, thank you. Ben Lamoureux for $5 says, I've heard that Deuteronomy is laid out similar to an Assyrian vassal contract,
He's
but
bringing all whole things
Assyria. Exactly, but replaces Assyria with Yahweh. Could you speak to some of the parallels? Sure.
This is one of the great discoveries. Obviously, it couldn't happen until we had rediscovered all the Mesopotamian texts in the late 19th century. But people started to realize that Mesopotamian treaties, Hittite treaties from ancient Turkey, and Assyrian treaties, especially from the Neo-Assyrian period, 8th, 7th century, followed a relatively consistent format. And I'm not going to get all the pieces, but basically it's like historical prologue. Here's who all of the players are and how we're related to each other. And then, you know, sort of a demand for obedience, right? So here's who we are. You lesser vassal folks are going to obey me, the suzerain, right? And here are the terms of our agreement, right? So you will give me this money and you will let me do this and I'll come to whatever. And then a series of blessings and curses. If you break this treaty, if you keep this treaty, I will, give you like whatever. I will protect you from your enemies, and I promise to whatever. And if you break it, I will come down on you with all the fury of 1,000 Mardukes, et cetera, whatever. And then there's like, okay, and then there's like provisions for taking care of this document. Okay, this document shall be placed in the temple of our temple of Marduk and in your temple of whoever your god is, and shall be on display, and it shall be read out loud every year to make sure that everyone remembers what the things are. Peace them out, right? Like that's the treaty formula. And those are basically the steps. I'm sure I missed one or two. That's Deuteronomy, right? Like here's the story of how we got here, right? With the remembering of all of the stuff in the wilderness. Here's the, and it says, right, obey my laws, right, keep my commandments, and here are the commandments. And you have, there are 15 chapters of law, in chapters 12 through 26, chapter 28, you get blessings and curses. I get instructions after that for how we're gonna like take care of this document. It's actually gonna be put in the ark, in the temple. It's gonna be read every 7 years to the people. It's gonna be read, right, the king's gonna have a copy. There's all the things. And it even takes some of the same, like, it even copies what seem to be some like individual wording, right? You shall neither add to nor subtract from this document, right? That's straight out of 🀭Assyrian treaty. It's right there in Deuteronomy at the end of chapter 13, beginning of chapter 13, it's right in there. The blessings and curses are so close as to almost be copied in some cases. Some of the laws are even occasionally similar, but mostly it's structural in that sense. And anyway, there's plenty more to say, but that's the idea. And this is not surprising, right? Scholars tend to date Deuteronomy to the end of the 7th century, mid to end of the 7th century, which is exactly the height of Neo-Assyrian influence in Canaan, in Palestine. So it makes sense, yes, the replacement of the king, who you have to be obedient to, with Yahweh, the deity, whom you have to be obedient to. But it's otherwise, essentially the same basic concepts.
Lovely, thank you. We have a few questions from Julian Brugnecker, who sends us a total of 20 Canadian dollars. Thank you very much, Julian. He says, I really enjoyed Dr. Baden's case studies in his book. Could he recommend more books that go into detail about the sources?
I have many other books. No. So it's interesting. There are, within the model to which I subscribe, that is neo-documentary, we're still relatively young. That is, this book, my book came out, whatever, in 2012, so 8 years ago. And it was meant at the time to be like the first major restatement of this in like 100 years. So I don't want to give you books from before then, because they're not going to, like, they're all going to be like earlier documentary stuff or non-documentary stuff. I will say Jeff Stackert has a book called A Prophet Like Moses, which I think which absolutely uses and restates this approach. There are books that are coming out that are not out yet. One from, this is going to help so much then, but Baruch Schwartz, who is my teacher, has a book coming out from Eisenbrauns at some point that's going to be sort of like a coherent statement, a relatively short, sort of here's what we're doing. Leanne Feldman, who teaches at NYU, has a book that'll be coming out at some point about the priestly source specifically, which is exciting, right? Like, Stackert and I are finishing a commentary on Deuteronomy. I have another book specifically on questions about the promise to the patriarchs and how that all works. So, I'll see if I can come up with some more. But there's like not a ton of new documentary stuff out there, and just in part because we're still like in the first decade of really getting after it. But there are plenty of people out there who sort of work with it as a model. This is the problem with academia, right? 8 years is like,
it's not that long.
It's nothing. So keep an eye out. Keep an eye out. And if you can probably bet that if you like follow me on Twitter, plug, that I will sort of mark the arrival of exciting books within this sort of intellectual framework.
And if you do want to follow Dr. Baden on Twitter, his Twitter link is in the description. So there you go.
And you've got a new book in Exodus coming out soon, right?
I have a book that just came out on Exodus that I don't seem to have with me. That's disappointing. I thought it was right there. I have a book on Exodus that came out a little over a year ago. It's a biography of Exodus, sort of like the afterlife. I usually focus on the birth of the book, right? That's what we're talking about here. Okay, what happened to it after it was born? It's in this lovely series from Princeton Press, which, by the way, has a 50% off discount right now. If you go to Princeton Press and you put in, I think it's PUP 50 or 30. Anyway, there's some code that they'll tell you to put in to get half off all Princeton University Press books, including all 3 of mine. Should you plug? Let's get to that part in the interview, guys.
It definitely is. You go for it.
Anyway, so yeah, I will, keep your eye out for stuff.
And there's a link for those who are interested going in the chat thread for Princeton Press. I will put it in the description when we finish talking. Julian Brugnecker, again, could Dr. Baden talk about why he believes there was only one compiler?
I'm really fond of the questions that come from somebody who clearly read the book. I haven't used the word compiler the entire time, but in the book that is the word I use. But to think about the notion of the question of how did the 4 sources come together? Was it a process of one source to another, and then those 2 with a third, and those 3 with a fourth? How would you make, right? So like it's an argument almost in the negative. How would you know that you had multiple redactional processes, multiple stages of redaction? The only way to see that in the text, I think, would be to see different redactional processes. These 2 are put together, right? Like, they always blended this, but like when these were, they didn't, right? So that would be like a different technique, right? Is there a different redactional technique at work? And there's not, right? Every source is combined using what seems to be the same redactional technique. That is, what has to have come next and what has to have come after that. And like, if I have to switch sources, I got to switch sources, and I have to combine sources into a single story. I have to combine them into a single story. So for example, the J and P both tell a flood story. And the person who put these together thought, quite logically, I can't have 2 floods that destroy all of humanity, at the end of which God promises never to do it again. But that has to be one story, right? So I took the J story and the P story of the flood and went like this and put them together. Okay, fine. Now what about the story of, what's a good example? So like, what about a story of, damn it, like, you got the same thing happen if you were looking at like a place where an E story was combined with a P story, or an E story with a J story, right? The same principle. If I can't put them, the sale of Joseph, right? That's a good one. But Joseph can't be sold into Egypt twice, because once he's there, right? So the compiler says, I got to put these together into one story, and the exact same process of putting J and E together, the same process I saw with J and P in the flood, and the same process I'll see with E and P in number 16, for example. Again, in order to argue for multiple redactional processes, I have to see multiple redactional techniques. And if I don't, I have no reason, because again, I'm inventing the compiler or the redactor entirely out of like the fact that there are multiple documents. I don't have like proof of the existence outside of that is the theory itself. So if I'm creating more than one, like now I'm sort of building fantasy on fantasy a little bit.
Good.
And it's a little hairy for me.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And Julian Brugnecker again, what is Dr. Baden's view of the dating of each of the 4 sources?
And the reason you have to ask that is because I strenuously avoid. I could not be like more. Okay, so but that said, no. The reason
world exclusive here.
The thing no one's ever gotten me to say in print. I'm not gonna say. The reason I don't like to date the sources, there's a couple. First of all, I don't have good data to do it on, right? Which is to say, J, or any of them really, not Deuteronomy so much, but most of the rest of them could have been dated anytime from like the creation of the temple, so like 9th century, 10th century, down to like the late post-exilic period in like the 4th century. Now there are reasons to think that those extremes aren't likely, but there's not great evidence for one or the other. for it being specifically somewhere else in there. I don't have like references to kings. Like, I can tell you that, the Book of Kings has to have been written no earlier than the last king it mentions. I don't have to do the same thing with the Pentateuch, right? You can write a story about Moses anytime you like. There's just not a lot of, if any, like direct historical references that help us date texts at least to like had to have been right, can't have been earlier than. At the same time, right, one of the things I said was I think each of the sources has its own literary history, right? That is, I'll take the priestly source for example. The priestly source, I think I can identify at least 3 layers and probably more within the broader work that we call the priestly work. So when I say what's the date of, what am I asking? When was the first, or like the original layer? When was the last layer before it was combined with the other stuff? Like when we're talking about schools and constant re-inscribing and rewriting of the thing, a date doesn't really work so much, right? There's like a date range, right? It probably belongs somewhere between here and there, and the extremes are less likely than closer to the middle. But that's the best we're gonna do. And the last thing I'll say on this is one of the reasons I avoid dating is because dating, like style and theme, became an argument for separating texts. People would look at a text and say, and still do, look at a story and say, or an episode, and say, this story makes the most sense if it was written in the following period. And since that isn't when this source was written, it can't be from that source. Which is backward, right? We can't date the source on the basis, like we have to be able to see the whole source and say, see the whole document and say, when could this whole thing have been? Rather than say, taking an episode. Aside from the fact that episodes are very hard to date, here's another recommendation. There is an essay, I'm pretty sure you can find it on academia.edu, among other places. There's an essay by Ben Sommer, S-O-M-M-E-R, who teaches at JTS, at Jewish Theological. It's out of a volume from a Pentateuch conference about almost 10 years ago now. And the essay is called something like On Dating Pentateuchal Texts or the Perils of Pseudo-Historicism, in which exactly what he's getting at is you cannot date texts by when you think they would have been most appropriate, right? Because if you did that, right, you would, like, and he has all sorts of examples from like contemporary literature, right? Like you would, you might think that, X text belongs to, it's just not. Anyway, and he goes through also a whole set of arguments where people say things like, because this text, mentions the cult, it must be from a time when the temple, existed. And then the same person will say later on, because this mentions the cult this way, it must be from a time when the temple didn't exist, and they're like looking for. There's no control. So that I think is the best thing that has ever been written in the field on dating texts, and its whole argument is don't. Not like that at least. Yeah. And that's the only way we could date Pentateuchal texts. So I'm not going to do it now.
Just a plug for a seriology. We don't have to worry about any of that shit. So
we just know
stuff. Where the tablet's at. So
sorry. That was not cool. That was not cool.
Come to a seriology. We have dates and cookies.
Zeva sends.
You should have stuff.
We have so much stuff. Oh my god.
And you have like buildings and things, and we have. I'm working with an 11th century CE manuscript. That's what I got. You're
doing a very good job with it.
I mean, you're the best.
Zeva sends us $10 and says, I've heard that Abraham followed through with the sacrifice of Isaac, and that's why later in the story he comes down the mountain alone and takes a wife later. Is this plausible?
So this is interesting. This is a very, very fringe theory in biblical scholarship. I think this is, I think it's related in a sense to, if I'm not mistaken, and don't quote me on this, I think the Quran has a variation on the sacrifice of Isaac, or maybe it's that Ishmael is the one who's gets brought up, but like they're tied into the problem that like the Abraham comes down alone, right? So the reason that this doesn't really work as a theory is because like Isaac is alive later in the story. But so I tend to think that the answer is no. But certainly there are, the story gets you real close. And as most biblical stories do, right, one of the like aspects of biblical storytelling is that it tends not to be as full as, say, Homeric. Right? So there's lots of gaps. And this is why we have, right, all of this, right, midrashic material from rabbinic Judaism. There's so many gaps to fill. So there's lots of ways to think about the stories and inventions that we can come up with that are all fill into the category of like reasonable interpretation. I don't think that there's a warrant for saying that the biblical text actually does that.
Thank you. And one more from Gerard Design, who says, can you comment on Yahweh's Asherah?
Yes, for those of you who are wondering what the hell that is. So Asherah is a Canaanite goddess known to us from the Bible and known from various manifestations from other Near Eastern like variants, right? One of the typical Near Eastern goddesses. And in the biblical text, she's known both as an individual goddess and sort of has given her name to sort of ritual poles, or sort of represent what became representations of trees. But your typical cult setting in Canaan would have an altar and a pillar and an Asherah, right? A tree, or a like ritual cultic stick of some sort. And so the biblical text tells us, tells the Israelites, destroy their altars, knock down their standing stones, and cut down their Asherahs. Okay. We have found an inscription at a trading site down in the Negev called Kuntila Dadrud. We found a piece of pottery that has on it drawings of various deities. That's kind of weird. And a line that says, right, essentially says dedicated to or for Yahweh and his Asherah. So the question is, what does that mean? The prevailing theory, which I tend to think is probably right, is that Asherah there stands for sort of a divine consort figure for Yahweh. Right? Remembering, as we always remember, that the Bible does not represent the vast majority of ancient Israelite religion and belief and practice, and that the notion that that Yahweh, the Israelite God, might have had a consort is totally not cool with the Bible, but was probably totally cool with most everybody else, right? Because it would have been sort of what they knew in their cultural milieu. So Yahweh and his Asherah is a really good non-biblical, archaeologically found sort of proof or evidence for this whole like non-biblical religion out there in which Yahweh, like most other gods in the ancient Near East, probably had a consort in the form of this goddess Asherah.
Wonderful.
And Ted Lewis's book is going to be coming out, I think, in the next month
Yes,
from
I think
Oxford
so.
University Press. So it's like over 1,000 pages or something, and talks about Israelite religion. So everybody in the audience, that's probably a good book to pick up.
Yes. So NKG5 asks, does Dr. Baden have a lecture series on the Yale website?
So
if not, he needs to get one real quick.
so I probably will at some point. I don't right now. What I have on the Yale website is if you go to yalebiblestudy.org, you will find a whole series of video conversations between Yale faculty, many of them for the Hebrew Bible, between me and my colleague John Collins, that are meant to be form the basis for small group Bible study or individual Bible study. 15-minute conversations, 8 of them approximately per biblical book or collection of books. Yalebiblestudy.org, you would find a whole set of me and other people talking about the biblical texts. And if you go to my Yale faculty webpage, there's like 3 or 4 videos of talks that I've given elsewhere in the world about this sort of stuff.
Wonderful. And that
And
link
I
is
watched-
in the side chat and will be in the description after the video.
I watched
is posted.
every one of those videos, so they're fantastic. Two of you sitting in a chair. It's great. I mean, not in the same chair, obviously.
It's a shame. I feel like that would probably add something to the conversation. So
Stupid
we
coronavirus.
are, it's 5:25 now. We probably have about 7 more questions. Are you happy to keep going, or do you need to actually
I
go
think
and
I
have
can
a
give you
live-
5 more minutes, and then I probably got to split.
That's
Sorry.
absolutely no. We've kept you far too long. Thank you. Hikari Tsukino, what are your thoughts on people who would ignore archaeological evidence that doesn't fit their theories?
Who would such people be? Unacceptable. Now, here's the thing I would say. Archaeological evidence is rarely as perfectly cut and dried, like as people want it to be, right? There's this notion that what biblical scholars do is kind of like, like murky playing around, but like archaeological evidence is like hard science. But archaeological data is simply the text of archaeology, and it is interpreted by archaeologists the same way that the biblical text is interpreted by biblical scholars. Which is not to say there aren't certain things that you could probably say with some certainty, but it's rarely the case that archaeological evidence is like pure, right? Like
Unequivocal,
hardcore stuff.
Mm-hmm.
An example of one that is, though, would be, for example, there's not a lot of these. The biblical text says Joshua destroyed Jericho, and the Jericho text, which is the archaeology of Jericho, says that for sure is not what happened. Right? Like it's chronologically impossible.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now there's lots of ways to interpret what's happening in Jericho, and there's lots of ways to interpret the biblical text, but those two just don't quite mix. So caution with archaeology is always, as with biblical interpretation, is always welcome, with limits.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Naeem Ubuntu says, could they have used a Canaanite text to create the Tanakh?
So, no. Not like, no. There are parts of the Hebrew Bible that look really Canaanite, right? Psalm 82, which is the one where Yahweh takes a stand, or like El takes a stand in the like council of Elohim and like says stuff about the other gods. Like if you like put Baal in there, you'd like for sure have a totally standard Canaanite text. If you took some Canaanite ritual texts, like lists of sacrifices and how you're supposed to do them, and subbed them in for a couple of chapters of Leviticus, 90% of readers would never notice. Right? They might just be like, a bunch of weird names of God in here, but like otherwise, it's the same thing, same bird, same like all the same things, not a problem. So there's a lot of Canaanite behind it, like a lot, which that's not the same thing as saying that like the Pentateuch or the Bible is a Canaanite text in that way, right? Where you draw the line between Canaanite and Israelite, right? At very least, the cultural claim that Yahweh is the God of Israel, which I think is, I often say, is about the only thing on which every part of the Hebrew Bible agrees and everything else is up for grabs. But Yahweh is the God of Israel is not a Canaanite claim.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Matthew Saunders asked several questions. We're going to
Pick the best.
Probably just stick with one.
And then we're probably gonna have to stop.
Yeah, that's fine. Says, is source criticism as a methodology on the rise or decline in biblical scholarship?
Yeah, so I'm gonna say this in two parts. The first thing, it's like a matter of clarity, and it's a weird thing to say, but source criticism, despite its name, is not really a method, right? The method is reading and asking questions about how it came to be. Source criticism, because it has source in the title, right, is actually the solution, right? The sources are the final product of the reading process and the analytical process, not the beginning. Mm-hmm. Okay, I've said that. Now, what you're really asking is the question and the asking of where does this text come from, and how is it divided? How do we deal with its various component parts? Is that question on the rise or the decline? And I think the answer is it's on the decline. And that's because all of historical critical method is on the decline and should be, right? We have been doing historical critical methods for 150 plus years, and we have no shortage of writings on them and no shortage of folks who are doing them, myself included. But being on the decline in this case simply means that the field is doing more stuff. And in a lot of senses, more interesting, newer, innovative, relevant, creative stuff, right? So in programs that were once universally historical critical, now there are people who are not doing this, or there's nobody who's doing historical critical. There's people who are doing all sorts of new, interesting approaches to the text. And to my mind, like, that's good. Historical criticism should not be the defining feature of biblical scholarship. It should be, one among equals. It asks this particular question, right? How did this come to be if I look backward? But it's like, that's one question. And even though it's what I do for the most part, I don't necessarily think it's the most interesting to everyone or the most important or the most relevant or any of those things. So it is on the decline. It is not going away. Hooray for that.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but there were very many questions. So thank you very much for your engagement.
And Dr. Baden, thank you so much. I'd keep you on here for 2 or 3 more hours, but you have a life, and I guess so do we. So
well, if there's so many questions, I'm happy to come back and just do we can talk about it more.
I get you to
go all day,
something
right?
No, that would be wonderful. I'd love to have you come back. So we'll, I'm sure we'll work that out. But thank you again. Thank you everyone for watching. And Dr. Baden, if you want to say anything before we go, any last plugs?
Thanks to you guys. Great time as always.
Well, it was a pleasure, and I really enjoyed it, and I hope everybody else did too. So until next time, everyone, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that?